Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Nasir Khilji. He retired from the US Treasury as a senior economist last year. He's a mentor, he's a dear friend. And I'm your host, Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor in chief of Fair Observer. So, Nasir, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, too.
Well, today we are going to discuss the global economy, and who better than a man who spent a long time in the US Treasury. So, without further ado, there is a lot of talk about stagflation. There's a lot of talk of the end of globalization. So, question: where do you see the global economy headed? Is it the end of stagflation? Is it the end of globalization?
Well, first of all, one has to define what we mean by stagflation and globalization. Stagflation is meant to mean that you have simultaneously inflation, high inflation, and high unemployment. Term was coined in the late 1970s, and because at that time, clearly the U.S., especially the U.S. and the world, was experiencing high amounts of inflation and at the same time high amounts of unemployment. So, in answer to your question, are we back to the late 70s and early 80s? There are some factors, and there are some people who believe that we may be heading back to that kind of scenario, especially after the fact that we had COVID, where that led to a lot of supply chain issues, led to a lot of maximum fiscal stimuluses,
Hmm.
a lot of monetary easing by all central banks. So all that may have come home to roost, given the supply shocks, high supply chain problems, and due to demand pull inflation, we've had a record amount of inflation in 30 years that we never experienced. 30 years, we experienced this but 30 years ago. So is it possible that this can continue? Are we back into that scenario? I would say that the majority of people, especially economists and such, they think that we are headed for a recession, given the fact that we had very high inflation in 2022, and the federal and central banks, especially in the advanced countries, like the European Central Bank, or the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, they all basically stamped on the brakes, increased their policy rates tremendously. The fear is that which is like a demand softening policies, coupled with supply shocks like the Ukraine Russian energy crisis, oil prices, energy prices rising, that may cause inflation. Inflation is calling this, breaks by the central banks. So we may end up in a recession, and at the same time, we may have high amounts of unemployment,
And inflation. So,
high
so
amounts of inflation and unemployment. So we
Mhm.
may be in a round of stagflation. The question is, so if we end up with a recession and we at the same time have a high amount of inflation, then how long is that going to last?
Mm.
Personally, looking at the data, looking at how the last 3 months have transpired, there have been certain happy shocks in a way. Inflation in the USA, for example, has come down tremendously,
Mm.
starting from in the August, year to year in August, it was like over 8 or 9%. In the latest, we are down to like about 4% inflation. So although it's below the target, it's still high above the Federal Reserve's like target for a maximum amount of inflation.
Which
But
is
that has
2%.
which is two
Yeah.
percent. So it has come down quite a bit, very, very quickly,
Mm.
rapidly. So I do not believe there is a strong possibility that we may end up in a recession induced by central bank policy
Mhm. But you
trying
don't.
designed to reduce inflation, and that may halt a lot of economies or reduce their growth rates,
Mhm.
and that may lead to a higher unemployment. But I do not think there is that strong possibility. But there is a minority opinion that it may not be that bad.
Uh-huh. So when we talk of stagflation, the mind goes back to the 1970s. In 1960s, the US spent a lot of money. It spent money on the Vietnam War, and it also spent money on Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs. And they found that guns and butter put a strain on the fiscal stability of the country. And as a result, in those days, they used to be tied to the gold standard, and they had to go off the gold standard in 1971. In 1973, Richard Nixon formally abandoned the gold standard. So there was both fiscal and monetary easing. And there was the oil shock as well that happened in 1973 as a result of the Yom Kippur War, as you've pointed out many times. So there are eerie parallels to today. At that time, there was fiscal easing, there was monetary loosening. Today also, there is fiscal easing and monetary loosening. So are we now in for a prolonged period of inflation, maybe not in the US, but elsewhere, such as Europe?
Well, that's a good question. But although everyone wants to draw parallels to the late '60s and the '70s, but those parallels may not be relevant. The reason being that in 1970, like you rightly point out, we were under the Bretton Woods system. So where, like the US dollar was pegged and the US economy as a percentage of the world economy was much higher than where it is right now.
Mhm.
There wasn't much globalization. And what had happened, as you rightly point out, the Great Society programs that were basically domestic demand driven and the Vietnam War, which started increasing trade deficits for the USA, especially because the US was spending overseas
Mm.
on the Vietnam War. And since the US was committed to take the dollars and at $32 an ounce of gold, there was an increasing outflow of gold from Fort Knox.
Uh,
So there was no way that the US could sustain all those dollars were coming home to roost. So that led Nixon to stop declaring, buying up the gold. And that's what led the USA off the gold standard. And once you go into a floating system, although there was that belief, economists believe that the floating exchange rate is like a shock absorber. It would absorb inflationary shocks. But initially, as the dollar went off the gold standard and the dollar depreciated, there was inflation, definitely because of all the dollars outside. So that clearly that was one parallel you can say, given what has happened recently, where the U.S. spent a lot of amount of money, like fiscal stimulus over the years 2021 and even 22, and that has created a lot of demand. And at the same time, you've had supply chain issues where supplies have been, there's been a lack of supply, and that has caused prices to shoot up. So that again, we tend to focus on the USA, although that same phenomena appears to be happening in major countries like the Eurozone and England, and of course, China, and so on. But I do not think that the parallel is valid, exactly valid, because now we do have a lot of emerging economies that may take up the slack. So I'm more optimistic than believing that we'll end up in the '70s in the future.
you always make the point that now we have trade. In the 70s, the US was autarkic, and now you have China, which exports a lot to the US. Now you have other emerging economies. So the slack could be taken up by others. That's the
Exactly.
argument.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you bring up, China, because the 2023 is 50 years later is a much different world, as you pointed out, globalization. In the '70s, the USA, in terms of trade, accounted for 10% of US GDP was accounted for by exports and imports of the USA. And today I was just looking at recent numbers. Now, in fact, if we look at the recent released numbers, actually imports account for close to about 17 to 19%
Mm,
of like a GDP,
mhm.
imports alone, and exports are actually 13%.
13, so well over 30%.
So well over 30% of US GDP is accounted for by international trade. So the US is a much more open economy than it used to be in the '70s. So that's one fact. Secondly, China, the rise of China. China now, by many counts, by my estimation, is a larger economy than the USA. If we start in talking about purchasing power parity
The
terms,
PPP terms.
PPP terms.
Hmm.
Although, like per capita, they are much lower than the USA, but in PPP terms, they are much higher. And even at the market exchange rate, China constitutes close to 25% of the world economy. So if you take China at 25%, you take USA like at say 27%, and then you add the Eurozone,
Hmm.
we're already talking about 70% of the world economy.
Uh-huh. I
So,
see.
given that 70, and then you have the rest of the world economy. The major is like India.
Hmm.
India is a growing economy, growing much faster than most economies in the world presently. So that may be another big powerhouse in the future. So, given this kind of constellation, and given the trade that has been going on between these countries, I think the outlook is going to be determined by how these three major blocks, you know, uh, fare over the next 2 years. And I think, given the policy constraints, given the breaks by the central banks, and given easing of fiscal stimuli, I think we may be headed back to more normal times. And given that COVID is receding.
Well, so more normal times mean the times of globalization inaugurated after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, there has been a lot of talk in Capitol Hill. There's been a lot of talk in various policy-making circles and numerous newspapers and magazines about the end of globalization, or globalization turning into globalization, or friendshoring, nearshoring, reshoring. The US has launched the CHIPS Act to try and cut out China from advanced semiconductor technology. The US has also launched a Green Technology Act, to which the EU is calling foul. They say the US now has an industrial policy. So it seems that, at least at the high technology level, there is again a focus on industrialization at home. And that might mean that some of the winds of growth that helped emerging economies may not be as strong.
I think that that's a very good, point, and that merits quite a bit of discussion when we talk about globalization. Clearly, if we look at the last 50 years, and when as the U.S. economy opened up, and started increasing imports first to Japan and then China
Mm.
and then other countries, that resulted in what they call the proverbial Rust Belt
Yeah.
that emerged in the USA, where there was a lot of labor that was let go from the old manufacturing, and they were unemployed and so on. So there was a big reshuffling of the U.S. economy, and it has suffered quite a bit. And I think politically it has led to a lot of repercussions, like Trump economics and so on
Yeah.
and so forth.
I mean,
Uh,
Ross Perot talked about it as early as 1992 when he talked about the giant sucking sound. And
exactly,
of course, Trump brought protectionism back with a vengeance.
exactly. Yeah, no, I agree. I think the fundamental point that one doesn't bring up in these discussions, and I think we have to be very clear about what happened here.
Mhm.
Okay, clearly the U.S. when it was growing, it was an autarkic economy. It lucked out that the World War II was going on in European, which were all destroyed, and Japan and so on. So it became a major trader, and its manufacturing capacity was intact fully.
Yeah.
So they were able to gain from international trade,
They were
and
never bombed at home.
and they were never bombed at
Yeah.
home. So they basically got on the bandwagon of free trade everywhere because it benefited the USA.
Mhm.
And as time went on, and
Mhm.
as the other economies like Japan and the Europeans emerged and the Germans emerged, the USA started feeling competition.
Mm.
So that, with like a monopolistic attitude, costs were increased. They were able to pass them on to the consumers, the international world. But now they had given generous benefits to their labor unions.
Mm,
So now they were stuck when they were facing competition from Japan and Germans and so on, who were bringing in high quality products and they were selling them, coupled with the fact that the US dollar previously when we were in the gold standard, the dollars had to be redeemed with gold.
mm,
But now there was no redemption going on.
mm.
So it was essentially what happened at the same time that the dollar became a reserve currency rather than gold,
So
which
this strengthened the
that
dollar, so it
strengthened the dollar.
increased
So
the purchasing power of the dollar.
that increased the purchasing power of
Yeah.
the dollar. That led, so on the one hand, they had high costs
Mm,
anyway, and then compounded by a higher value of the dollar, made their goods non-competitive with the rest of the world. And clearly, Germans and the Europeans, other Europeans, and the Japanese gained by that, clearly. So when that happened initially, the USA was still a powerhouse enough to take that and still believed in free trade. But as we come into the 90s and 2000s, as people started, feeling that pinch, so it was a great deal for the consumers, but it was really hard for the producers
So
in the
once China
USA.
enters the WTO in
And then
2001, everything changes.
and
Now the
then China
competition
comes
is too
in.
tough.
So if you keep in mind that
Mm,
around Reagan's time, Reagan was a free trader
yes.
by philosophy.
Yeah.
So essentially, what they came out was a very imaginative deal with the Japanese. Rather than basically putting tariffs or restricting trade with the Japanese, they made the Japanese agree to restrict, voluntary restraint in importing to the USA. It's called the VRA, Voluntary Restraint Agreement,
Yes.
and the Louvre Accords, and there was a lot of those accords
Yeah.
that went on in the 80s. So, and then of course the Chinese got into the act.
Mm,
Now, we have to bring in the politics. Most economists believe that there are winners and losers in free trade.
mhm,
When you have free trade with other economies, you excel at what you specialize in,
mhm,
and you basically import on things that you do not specialize in,
mhm.
where the opportunity cost is higher.
Yeah. So
So
you
that
export
means
Boeings to Bangladesh, but you get T-shirts in return.
exactly. So essentially, what that means is that as the textile industry gets out of the USA,
Mm,
people are let go. So now, generally, the idea in trade, international trade, has always been, even in free traders, that the winners should be able to compensate the losers.
mhm.
Well, that did not happen in the
Because
sense that somehow the policymakers were always, they never really thought about, because, again, depending on which party was in power, they didn't realize that you have losers in trade, they didn't want to extend welfare benefits and social benefits because these were the Republican, the conservative side of the US
But even
system.
even the Democrats under Bill Clinton, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, adopted the free trade mantra: lock, stock, and two smoking barrels.
Exactly. Well, essentially, what happened there was, as you pointed out initially, when you had the Great Society program, it's like a pendulum. You know,
Hmm.
so with government largesse and a lot of spending in the 60s and the 70s, the U.S. government became very huge
Mm,
relative to the past. So essentially, the welfare benefits had increased tremendously,
mm,
social welfare. Given that fact, the U.S. had deficits and had started having debt, especially after the Carter years. And given that fact, that had caused inflation. It had, and then because of that, the central banks had to act, and that caused unemployment in the Volcker years,
yeah, Paul Volcker,
Paul
and
Volcker,
and
and
he
so on,
killed inflation by raising interest rates
raising interest
repeatedly.
rates and so on.
Yeah.
So at that point, by the time Bill Clinton came around, there was a new deal. The pendulum was actually had moved when Reagan came in. The pendulum had moved all the way to the left in terms of welfare spending and so on,
Hmm.
or government, programs. And now the U.S. government or the citizen less expansive government and Reaganomics was a result of that,
I
which
see.
led to lower taxes, and essentially lower taxes. But unfortunately, it didn't lead to lower spending because the Reagan increased the defense budget.
Yes, and it's spent on Star Wars. And in fact,
Spent,
George Bush Sr. called it voodoo economics.
which George Bush, because
Yeah,
ideally it was called supply side economics,
yeah,
that given that the tax rates had gone up so high,
yeah.
that basically it was a self defeating purpose for the government. Whenever they tried to raise taxes, revenues would go down rather than going up. And the only way because of the underground economy,
Mhm.
people stopped, they had no incentive.
They'd become a bit like Italians.
They had no, exactly, no incentive to work or your marginal effort. So in order to, so the Reaganomics, the supply side, coined by Laffer and so on, the Laffer curve, for example, the idea was that if you lower the tax rate, government revenues will increase. Well, Reaganomics was basically like, think of it as a lab experiment, which failed, miserably. So the taxes were reduced, which resulted in huge amounts of deficits and debt. And then when Bill Clinton arrived on the scene, he had no choice. So essentially, the whole country's mood had changed. The pendulum had swung to the right because people were getting fed up with the big government. And they thought that government was the source of all problems. And so when Bill Clinton came along the scene, one of his promises was he was going to cut government,
Mm.
have deregulation in the economy. So he was in many ways a right winger on that point.
So he was in many ways following Republican policies. And you
Exactly,
could
or the mood
argue,
of the country.
exactly, or the mood of the country. And you could argue that Donald Trump was following Democrat policies of protectionism when he came to power. And,
Essentially, because again, notice what happened. This is that's very interesting. That how Donald Trump basically was able to steal the Democrats' constituents. The normal constituents of the Democrats have always argued. When free trade, especially in the 70s, they were always there arguing for protection, and their constituents were the labor unions and blue collar workers.
Mhm,
And basically the presidents that we had around that time were people like Lyndon Johnson
mhm,
and John Kennedy and Jimmy Carter,
yeah,
who were basically identified more as people from the rural areas. They identified more with the blue collar workers. And by the time Bill Clinton came along, and then followed by Obama and so on, the blue collar people, and especially when they found without a job and getting strained without much benefits from the government, and the new Democrats supposedly that came in with Bill Clinton, that they got very disaffected and disaffected with the whole Democratic Party. They thought it was very elitist. So Trump found really good avenue, a good constituency that he was able to steal from the Democrats. The point that Trump was making was that although he believed in free trade, he believed that China had been cheating
mm,
on free trade. So we have to distinguish that. So you can be a free trader, but that doesn't mean that you allow cheating.
mhm,
If you look at the facts of how China came into the WTO with the help of the USA, although they didn't meet all the conditions
mhm,
of the WTO, how the US opened up its borders. They knew that China trade was asymmetric.
mhm.
China was exporting to the USA, but not opening its borders,
Opening its own economy.
economy
Yeah.
to the US goods
And stealing intellectual
and
property.
stealing intellectual. So the US, in fact, looked the other way. And the great question is why? No one ever questioned that. And the reason was that the USA made a political bargain with the Chinese, an implicit bargain. So essentially, they opened up all this. They knew very well what China was doing. So it was not that they had blinkers on, but what they were getting in return was hoping that by that the China will emerge and be part of the USA, be friendly with the USA, be allied with the USA, vote along with the USA on
Mhm,
sanctions to key countries like Iran,
mhm,
which it was able to obtain from China.
mhm.
So it was a quid pro quo.
In the
So
early days, of course, it was an anti Soviet move when Nixon went to
exactly.
China.
So
And of
initially,
course,
it
1978 Deng opened up the economy, and
yeah,
the 80s,
and then
it began
80s
that
and
way. Yeah.
90s, it became like a quid pro quo. So politically, the USA was gaining, having
Hmm.
China's support
Hmm.
internationally,
Hmm.
and internationally they were helping China gain access.
So,
So when Trump came along, he did not understand the connection between the two.
mhm,
And then he just said, well, China has been cheating. So I'm going to punish the Chinese. So he believed in free trade,
mhm.
but he believed in fair trade.
Yeah.
And that was his mantra.
And you were in the Treasury at that time. And what was the result of his sanctions? Did they work?
Well, actually, I did a study. I was asked to do a study by Trump administration. And when they put in tariffs on China, even they put on tariffs on Europe. But let's just focus on the China, the 242 sanctions, they call them. So I looked at, their tariffs that were put on Chinese imports, the USA. And that whole claim that the Trump administration had made that the Chinese would pay for the tariffs and the American consumer would be spared the higher prices was in fact not true, borne by a lot of studies that I surveyed at the time. So essentially, the Trumpian logic of putting tariffs on and making the Chinese swallow it by lowering their prices actually backfired. The trade deficit never improved under Trump.
All right. So we talked about globalization in the US. We talked about how the mood has turned more protectionist. And it seems this is the new zeitgeist. After all, Britain has voted for Brexit. Xi Jinping is not as open as Deng Xiaoping. And all the advanced economies seem to be battening down their hatchets. So, does that mean that we will see what people argue globalization or friendshoring, reshoring, nearshoring? Because it seems that the advanced industrial economies or the advanced economies want some industry back. They may not want to make socks or they may not want to make bottles, but they do want to make high tech stuff.
I think we need to discuss globalization a little bit more. So let's talk a little bit more about this whole globalization. Clearly, there is no formula or no metric that says, okay, this is optimal globalization.
Hmm.
Okay. So no one knows what optimal globalization is. Because clearly, in an interdependent world,
Mm.
vulnerabilities get exposed, especially when you have political problems.
Yes.
So, the more globalized you become over time, the hope is that politically you're also unified.
Mm. But the Russia Ukraine war has given us
Has
a food, fertilizer, and
exactly.
fuel crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So, what we need to do is to grow
Hmm.
towards what is the optimal. So, if it were a peaceful, normal world, you could increase globalization because it's like a unified world.
Hmm.
But if you start having embargoes and sanctions, clearly that exposes vulnerability, as the Ukraine-Russian war has told you.
And
Number
the
one,
and the embargoes, as you say, are much more severe than in the past.
exactly. So that's one
Mm.
that can actually hurt yourself. Even if you were to embargo on like a rogue regime,
Hmm.
you're hurting yourself because you're dependent on them. Like Russia is a classic case where
Hmm.
most of energy is supplied by Russia to the Europeans. So now they are imposing sanctions on Russia and they realize how vulnerable they are. So when we talk about global, that's one part of the story. So there's no optimal amount of globalization. It depends on the political evolution of the global system,
Mm.
number one. Number two, it has exposed another, sensitive, area is how much of unemployment, how much of cheating can you bear? Like I was talking about
Yeah.
for your political advantage.
Yeah.
And that has also brought it to the fore.
Hmm.
Because similarly, when the Asian tigers were expanding
Hmm.
in the 90s, it was a very similar argument that the USA made. Open your economy,
Mm.
and that way you'll bring in all these economies into democracy, human rights, and so on. So there's been these, implicit bargains that the USA has tried to make with a lot of these, regimes that are not exemplary for their human rights and it has learned along the way.
Mhm.
Thirdly, is how much labor can you displace? So if it were free and fair trade on both sides,
Ah,
then it would be a different matter.
yeah.
Now, given all those kind of qualifications, free and fair trade, what is the extent of globalization, vulnerabilities that if you get into political wars and stuff, so all that they come into a calculation looking into the future. And finally, given what China has been able to accomplish, it has mostly grown on the back of the US and the more advanced countries.
Hmm.
It has not grown because of its own consumer.
Yeah, it's an export
It's an export,
oriented
clearly an
economy,
exporter.
export led
So
growth.
essentially, what China has been able to do, it has actually supplanted a lot of other countries that could, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and it has supplanted that, and it has reached the limit of tolerance for the more advanced countries like the USA. And so I think the extent of globalization, I mean, the extent of
Hmm.
trade between countries because of that big factor of China and China not reciprocating.
Hmm.
Similarly, with the Asian tigers.
Hmm.
Similarly, well, Japan was a different story where it played the same game.
Yes, but it
You
was a
know,
smaller
it
player.
was a much smaller player.
Yeah,
Although it tried to play the same game, it
yeah,
was smaller. And the USA was able to negotiate with the Japanese. So, given that, and Donny Roderick and others have mentioned it, and you and I wrote a piece about it at the extent of industrializing. So,
exactly.
at the final analysis, if countries think like Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, that they can grow by trade
Mm,
and trading with the North, they're mistaken.
they're mistaken.
They're
So,
mistaken.
w-
So they should be thinking, and we talked about it.
yes, they should be thinking of increasing their productivity growth through industrialization, developing their domestic markets.
Exactly.
Understood. So that was a very clear answer as to both stagnation and to globalization. Let's move to the Russia Ukraine war.
Okay.
You've had a ringside view in the administration. In fact, you predicted inflation when you were in the Biden administration when the stimulus was cooking. And of course, now the war has come. The question on everyone's minds is a very simple one. And we have discussed it a wee bit. And the question is this war leading to an inflationary spiral, or is it just a one off shock? And this is a question that Europeans in particular are nervous about. European industry, the Mittelstand, some people are saying, has got Mittelkaput. Energy prices rose dramatically for them, and they are struggling. German industry is not competitive as of now. Italian industry also is suffering because they relied on Russian gas as well. So, what goes on from here because of this war?
Okay. I think, that's a question that's on everyone's mind.
Hmm.
And when I was in the administration, when I was in Treasury, and like I was in charge of the sector around the world,
Mm.
especially oil, natural gas prices, and how they were behaving and the outlook for them.
And our listeners should know that you began as an energy economist.
Well, I was a macroeconomist in the energy
Ah, okay.
department, but
Okay.
I did, like through
Yeah,
maybe osmosis,
you picked it up.
picked up a lot of energy jargon and well, like keep in mind that energy is more. It's like a small market. So for an economist to analyze energy markets is just use your tools of supply and demand.
Aha,
So it doesn't mean that you become an energy economist. It's
exactly.
like you're talking about demand for housing
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
supply for housing. So when I was in the energy department for 8 years at the Energy Information Administration, and one of my job was to actually produce, macroeconomic outlook, both for the US and for the world. And
Aha.
it was not only for like 2 or 3 years,
Hmm.
but it was actually for 25 years because the energy markets do not change in 2 years, they change over a period of time.
Hmm.
Nuclear plants get built, it takes 10 years to get a
Hmm.
nuclear plant on, and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. But anyway, backtrack to your question. I think in terms, first of all, as you pointed out, there are three major economies that constitute close to 75% of the
Yeah.
world.
The US,
China,
the EU, and
European, and
China.
the US.
Yeah.
So Russia is a very small player,
Hmm.
and Ukraine is even more so.
Hmm.
What makes Ukraine very, which I didn't realize, they're a big wheat exporter.
Yeah. And sunflower and
Yeah.
fertilizers.
And so they're big exporters in particular niche areas.
Yeah.
And of course, Russia, although it's a major exporter to the Europeans, the US, just to give you some numbers, they're exporting, before the war started, they were exporting 6 million barrels per day in 100 million barrels a day of world
Hmm.
to the world. 6 million barrels.
Hmm.
So generally, in my studies, there's a rule of thumb that for every 1% decrease in the supply
Hmm.
of oil prices can shoot up by 10%.
I see.
So if you take 6 million barrels, and you're talking about a 100 million barrel market,
Hmm.
which is 100%.
Hmm.
So if you take 6 million barrels off the circuit, so you're talking about like about 60% increase in the oil prices.
Hmm.
So if the oil prices had been like, say, $40,
Hmm.
they would have shot up to $80, which they did
Hmm.
initially.
Hmm.
But then what happened? That Russian oil just didn't stay in the ground. It found markets.
It flowed. It seeped through to China and
It
India.
flowed, who were the major consumers, who
Yeah.
don't produce more of their own oil
They are
supplies.
energy starved.
They are energy starved, and
Yeah.
basically, so it's not that 6 million barrels didn't find their way into the market. They were there. And what has happened? Oil prices presently are like $80 a barrel, but not because of the Ukraine and Russian war.
But because of
They're
Saudi Arabia and
because
OPEC
of,
plus.
exactly. So that is what's driving the thing. So most of the initial shock of the
Hmm.
war and the sanctions for the whole world
Hmm.
have been absorbed.
So it's a
So
one-off, as per you.
yeah, so it has been. So now it is adjusting
Hmm.
to the realities of the war, which means that oil has found different ways to get to the market, the world market.
Mm.
Russia has found ways around the international payment system.
Yes, they were kicked out of SWIFT, but they didn't do too badly
They
at the end
haven't
of the
done
day.
badly.
Yeah.
Their balance of payments has not suffered.
Hmm.
So, what are the long lasting effects of the Russian Ukraine war? There's going to be a lot of human toll to this.
Mm.
Let's not minimize that.
Mhm.
But in terms of economic damage, whatever had to happen has already happened.
I see. Now, you talked about the human toll. So let's talk about economies that are in trouble. And there are a lot of them. Argentina has gone to the IMF. Pakistan has gone yet another time to the IMF. Bangladesh has gone to the IMF. Sri Lanka went through a terrible crisis and crowds broke into the president's palace. And one could go on. There's a real debt crisis on in poor countries. Um, is that because of the Russia Ukraine war, or was the war just a needle that pricked a bubble?
It goes back to the energy prices,
Hmm.
because a lot of countries are
Hmm.
energy importers, like oil importers.
Hmm.
Like Pakistan is a major importer of
Sri
oil.
Lanka is,
Sri Lanka is,
Argentina is.
Argentina is.
Yeah.
So as oil prices have gone from like
Hmm.
$40 to $80, clearly they're feeling the crunch.
Hmm.
Similarly, at the same time, because of COVID recession,
Hmm.
demand for their products went down. So
Hmm.
they've had trade difficulties as the world economy has
Hmm.
slowed down.
So income went down and expenditure went up, and they found
And
themselves
yeah, and
in hot water.
as trading, they had deficits
Yeah.
that they had to finance. So clearly, the IMF itself, when COVID happened, was more lenient with these,
Hmm.
different programs, structural adjustment programs that they had
Yes.
under the enhanced facility.
Yeah.
So they were willing to be lenient. And of course, Sri Lanka and others, Argentina, they had these major problems. I would not put all of them in the same boat. Like Argentina, like you mentioned, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are different types of requests, you can say. Argentina is a habitual. It has
Offender.
had, because of its political situation,
Yes.
historically, it's been one of those cases where they've had structural deficits and debt,
Mhm.
and they've been repeatedly to the IMF, and they've
And
also
they've
defaulted.
defaulted on their
They've
debt
also
too. Yeah.
defaulted on that. Sri Lanka was also a very special case. It's a very small economy.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter much to the world economy. Again, I'm not minimizing
No,
Sri Lanka, but
I
again,
understand, but they're a small economy and they're an externally vulnerable economy because they
external
export tea and
exactly.
they
Yeah,
export other
yeah.
commodities.
Bangladesh has gone to the IMF, but for a very valid reason, because of COVID. It's
Mhm.
not that they had any structural problem.
I
It's
see.
more that they've had a recession.
Mhm.
Their trade has suffered,
Mm.
but they've got all their, like marbles in a row, so to speak.
Mhm.
They're actually doing much better than India and Pakistan in terms of economic growth or progress. So clearly, they've gone to the IMF, but if you look at their history, it's a much more, I think, unusual circumstance rather than a usual thing like Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is a basket case. Sorry to say, I'm a
17th
Pakistani,
by
and
origin.
and yeah, like in 19th, I've even lost count how many times Pakistan has been able to do this.
Yeah.
And that is, in a way, another theme that I want to push forward. And I've done some papers on it, especially US aid to its major client states
Yeah.
like
They,
Egypt, Pakistan,
yeah, we
Thailand,
talk about
Turkey,
geopolitical rent. They
geopolitical rent.
rent.
So the USA over the years,
Yeah.
starting in the 50s, has cultivated ties with these client states
Yes.
that, in a way, has basically engendered essentially a very different mindset of rentiers
Mm.
who do not even have the energy resources, but they're rentier states because of location.
Hmm.
And Pakistan is a big example.
Hmm.
Egypt is another example. That
Turkey is another.
Turkey, in a way, exactly. Turkey was an example until Erdogan came along.
Yeah.
And because he no longer is
Playing ball.
dependent on the USA, he's more independent.
Yeah.
He can stand up, and the military has basically lost influence
Yeah.
in his country, where the military used to be the pro-American
Yeah.
client. So when Erdogan got his own constituency, we stood up to the military. I think and that's why they're suffering. They have
Yeah, they have.
tremendous
I mean, partly
devaluations.
they are suffering also because he refuses to raise interest rates in the
Yeah,
face of inflation.
That
That
is all economics. That is kind of weird.
I don't understand
Yeah,
ergonomics
yeah,
one bit.
yeah.
I mean, some
So
people tell me it's because he's a devout Muslim and he's against interest rates, but
yeah.
whatever the reason, they have
So his
160% inflation.
talking about voodoo economics, his economics is on the same page. Voodoo economics.
To the
So I
extreme.
don't to the extreme. So Turkey is a different case compared to these client
Rentier
states
states, yeah.
like
Frontier.
especially Egypt and Pakistan.
Yeah.
These are two classic cases.
Mhm.
Other countries have graduated off the list. If you notice, Indonesia is out of that.
Yeah, Indonesia is done much better
It has much better because over the years they
last
became
year,
independent,
last few years.
getting World Bank handouts or the IMF.
Mhm.
So they've actually distanced themselves from that. So I think it has to do with this whole mindset of certain countries like Pakistan and Egypt, particularly, and actually Egypt receives close to $2 billion every year from
Mhm.
the US
Mhm.
as part of that agreement
Mhm.
with the Israelis.
Mhm.
So that I think has brought a different mindset. And then the role of remittances that
Mhm.
has brought in, that has led to a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, a lot of things that are going on, reduced tax revenues. So the Pakistan and Egypt are a continuing case of it. They need to reform, and I don't think that that's going to happen very soon.
So, I mean, Pakistan and Egypt are, of course, suffering, and so is a lot of Africa. And
Of
Africa
course,
has a debt crisis again, and of course, these countries were overextended in some ways, like Sri Lanka. Because
yes,
if you're a
correct.
Ghana, if you're a Kenya, then you rely on tourism, and that vanished.
Yes, of
Or
course,
you sell cocoa, or you sell tea, you sell commodity. And the same holds true for Latin American countries that are suffering too.
sure, yes,
So
yeah.
do you see them rebounding in a year or two as the as the energy crisis subsides and a new reality takes over?
Well, again, like I'm not a specialist on each one of these
Yeah.
countries, but I can talk in broad terms. Like Africa, for example, is basically primarily a commodity
Yes.
based
Yeah.
country,
So is Latin America.
and so is mostly Latin
Yeah.
America. So they always go to boom bust. Commodities go up,
Yeah.
So they're like they haven't diversified that much into other areas, and that's the same with of course Latin America. And then you have these like countries that were promising like Venezuela,
Mm,
Brazil, Argentina. They've had political problems,
mm,
the rise of populism,
mm,
socialism,
mhm.
and again
Or even far right populism, both.
far
So,
right
so I mean,
populism,
Latin America almost swings.
like Brazil, for example.
Yeah,
Yeah, look at the way.
deeply divided. January
Yeah,
8th, they had an attack, just like the
exactly.
US did.
Yeah.
So,
So
so
so so essentially, so Latin America has a lot to do with political problems
I see.
rather than, and I cannot predict how the political situation is going to shape out for those countries. Yeah, as far as the economics is concerned, in broad terms, going back to our 75%, if we recover,
Yeah,
at least the grounds will be set for other economies
to
if they
recover
choose to really participate to recover.
based on the demand of this
Demand for their
75% of this global economy.
global economy.
So, on the whole, you take an optimistic view. And on that note, we'll bring this episode to an end. Nasir Khilji, thank you very much for your time. It has been a great pleasure and a privilege to have you on FO Podcasts. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you.